the people are uprising and so forth and so on. But behind the scenes, there's always, this sort of alliance with this Islamic leader. Originally it was Kashani, and now in 1978 it was the Ayatollah Khomeini. And he had been mentored by this person, Kashani, who had helped bring in the Shah back in the 1950s after we got rid of Mossadegh. All right, now the very next year, 1979, what happens is Jimmy Carter's president and his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, thinks he can use this Iranian government, including the Iranian Shiite mullahs, okay, this is important, as part of what he called this ARC. It was this ARC, A-R-C, Arc of Resistance from Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood, going eastward all across, Afghanistan, Pakistan, so on, against Soviet expansionism that was coming to the south. And so when these so-called students, supported Khomeini and took over the U.S. embassy in Tehran, Iran, that seemed to present a crisis, right? Okay, now, in this book I mentioned by Dreyfus, he says, quote, along with the threat from Khomeinism, some U.S. policymakers also saw opportunity using the Islamic right to undermine the Soviet Union in its own empire deep in Central Asia. The twin Islamic movements in Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood linked its organizations in al-Qaeda, Afghanistan. Those two were joining up, inspired Brzezinski and Bill Casey, he was the CIA director under Reagan, to pursue the Islam in Asia, Arc of Islam theme aggressively. So here they are. They're using this pan-Islamic movement that the British had started many, many years ago to stop Soviet expansion. And so Brzezinski developed a plan of financial and other support for Afghanistan. Here we are pumping money. This is supposed to alarm the Soviets and drive them down in there. First, Brzezinski denied it. Later on, 20 years later, he admitted that this was part of his plan to get the Soviets in a quagmire like we had had in Vietnam. And so the Soviets invade in December of 79. And after this, Zalmay Khalilzad, who was in Afghanistan first and then in Iraq and now at the UN for us, who interestingly in the 1990s was an ambassador or lobbyist for the Taliban. He was a RAND, R-A-N-D, corporation strategist, and he wrote a paper explaining that, quote, the Khomeini regime also poses risks to the Soviets. The change of regime has encouraged similar movements in Iraq and Afghanistan and might affect Soviet Muslim Central Asia. This is all part of this big plan for oil, the Caspian oil, and so forth. And the reason I bring that up is in the 1950s, in the early part, when Mossadegh was overthrown, there was this organization, World Association of Parliamentarians for World Government. They had a meeting in London, and basically they said when this world government comes about, certain nations' forces will be policing other nations. And the U.S., for example, would be in Yugoslavia where it is, and Australia where it is, and so on. And it'd also be in Kazakhstan. I thought to myself, 1950s Kazakhstan? Why? Maybe Moscow, Leningrad, whatever. But no, that's the Caspian region where a lot of the oil is located. Well, Brzezinski is all part of this at the first State of the World Forum in the 1990s. I have a tape of him. This is Gorbachev's State of the World Forum. He says, quote, we cannot leap into world government through one quick step. A consensual global system requires a process. The precondition for eventual genuine globalization is progressive regionalization, because by that we move towards larger, more stable, more cooperative units. And that's basically what Cecil Rhodes' plan was. One of his secret society members, Percy Corbett, in a 1942 book, Post-War Worlds, they explained that. It would be, they'd link up regional arrangements, involve trade, immigration, and so on. And so Brzezinski's part of this, and he wrote a book, The Grand Chessboard, in the late 1990s, where he was explaining how Caspian oil is a part of all this. And he said, there may be some Islamic backlash, but so what? He used the word manipulate. We can manipulate events and so on. It's all part of this grand chessboard, this plan. And eventually what they'll do is you'll have the European Union linked up with what they're now trying to get a Middle Eastern Union and ASEAN, and that's why they're playing the Arabs against Israel in the Middle East, the carrot stick.
As I'm reading this thing, okay, if we go back over we're almost talking about 100 years here in reality,
right,
of transition here. So you had the original luminaries, or as I call them, the oscurinaries,
yeah,
meaning those who have led us into darkness on much of this. You have people such as, you can even go to Albert Pike or Helena Petrovna Blavatsky on the theosophical side.
Right.
You have Cecil Rhodes and his vision of a global government. That was his vision, dominated by an Anglo-American alliance. We find out most of this stuff. So this is stage one, just sort of yes or no here.
Yep.
But basically, these people set the framework. And you were right. There was a lot of secret societies going on, all the way going back to Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati, which is different than what everybody calls the Illuminati today.
Right.
So that forms the bedrock of thought. Now, they have intellectual heirs, so to speak.
Right.
In other words, we're not talking about some master-controlled plan where every detail is written down to the last bolt from a back room. It's rather an ongoing succession of people. Then, as we move forward in time, these people, they agree with the original plan that Rhodes had or whoever it was, but they're willing to shuck and jive a bit with reality to make that come around. But all through it, you can sort of see the common thread, can't you, over 100 years of a goal.
Yeah, Rhodes said his, quote, conspiracy would last 60 years, and by then he'd have enough people in key positions in politics, economics, journalism, education, and so on, that he wouldn't need, quote, a so-called conspiracy, secret meetings and all that. What he would have is a network of like-minded globalists. And they, at this critical time in the early 20th century, occupied key positions in foreign affairs, and then in the U.S., of course, as well, like Brzezinski and others. And what they would do is through a dialectical process, play people against each other. Originally, it may be Arabs against Jews or moderate Muslims against more radical Muslims, because you have to constantly have the dialectic going. In global sense, they would play the communists against the West. In fact, Lincoln Bloomfield for the CFR wrote a paper in the early 60s for Dean Rusk, who was a Rhodes scholar, part of Rhodes's effort, saying if the communist dynamic were greatly abated, the West would lose whatever incentive it has for world government.
Yeah.
And so you have to have that playoff, that threat to cause people to compromise. You have to have a Hezbollah to cause Israel to compromise. You have to have crises, economic crises, or security crises. The U.S. citizens say, oh, my goodness, maybe we better have a larger security arrangement with Canada and Mexico, so we'll form this regional cooperation. So it's all pressing these people, whether it's in the Middle East or the U.S. or Asia or whatever, to compromise, and the dialectic is useful in that to get these regional entities, usually starting off economically or through security arrangements. Then you form a union so that you have the European Union. You still have the currencies, the pound and the lira and the franc and so forth, but here what you'll have is an economic crisis. The dollar will plummet. They'll have this Amero, will be the North American Monetary Union, and that was actually proposed in 1999 by the Fraser Institute of Canada. And then ultimately you'll link these all up into a common currency, and the date for that is 2018, and it'll be called the Phoenix. And if any of your listeners want to see it, just look at the January 9, 1988 cover of The Economist magazine from England. It'll show you a picture of the world currency to come. And so that's the plan. It involves, like I said, the Middle East and, the dialectic and so forth, and Javier Solana coming down and preventing Olmert from taking final action against Hezbollah to affect that. And in the second part of my article, What's the Role of Iran, I actually show how Hezbollah was established in the mid-90s for that purpose.
Yeah. We're not talking about people in back rooms and whatever. We're talking about very open people who find adherence to their way of thinking. They sort of bring them along, and they're pretty open about it, aren't they? You can go and read the memoirs of people who are dead.
And living. That
way you go back and say, well, Cecil Rhodes said this. And
And David Rockefeller, in his memoirs, the title of that book, 2002, said some people believe he and his family, because they were heavily involved in this oil arrangement over the 20th century, are part of a secret cabal conspiring against the best interest of the United States in order to form a more global, integrated political and economic structure, one world. And he said, there's a period there, and his next sentence is, if that's the charge, I stand guilty and I'm proud of it, end quote.